Welcome to the Big Money Questions Show. I'm Rachel Rickard-Strauss, Personal Finance Editor at This Is Money. This week, tax, is it too complicated? We have Angela Knight with us, and she is the Chair of the Office for Tax Simplification and also ex-Chief Exec of Energy UK and the British Bankers Association. Angela, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's start with the stonker. Is the tax system just too complicated?
Well, I think it's very complicated. I think everybody thinks it's complicated. There's probably somebody who doesn't, but I haven't come across them yet, and I doubt that I will. I think the question is it possible to make the tax system simpler for the customer, the you, the me, the businesses? And that's kind of the question that we're starting to think about at the Office of Tax Simplification.
Okay, so I mean, there's reams and reams of legislation, books of it. Accountants absolutely thrive off it.
That's right.
But in a sense, maybe that doesn't matter if it doesn't end up, causing too much drama for individuals, for consumers, for households, for businesses.
Well, there's always going to be a lot of tax legislation. And the reason for that is, first of all, we've been at it a long time. I'm going to say that income tax first came in to pay for the Napoleonic Wars, and it has to be renewed every year, certainly some taxes, income tax every year, for that reason. Somebody will no doubt get in touch with you and say, she's quite wrong, taxation has been there for many more years. That's fine. What is the case is that tax has been around a long time. We are a country that is a trading nation. We do services, we do goods, we do it all over the world. We have companies, we have businesses, we have PLCs, we have limited liability, we have partnerships with individuals, and we do lots of things. Inevitably, this is going to result in complicated legislation and lots of it. And you're right, if you print all the tax legislation off, it's going to run for yards and yards and yards. However, much of that legislation is there for tax avoidance reasons, to stop ways round, because I keep using the word legislation, and that's exactly what I mean. Tax is in law, life moves on, so you keep having to alter that law. But for us, for particularly us and small businesses, that is individuals and small businesses, to my mind, it's not just, have you got all this legislation? It's, can it be made so it's easier for you and me to use it? Because much of that stuff doesn't apply to us. So can we say, only that's the bit that you've really got to concentrate on? And as we do more and more and more stuff online, and indeed the Inland Revenue's got this big Making Tax Digital project, can we also then have apps? So you've got the app, the Reporters app, say. I don't know whether you're self-employed or not, I should have asked you that before. But you've got many people who are self-employed or a mixture of self-employed and part-employed. So can we just have apps that sit on the top of the system that make it simpler and easier for them to do? Those are the sorts of questions which we're now addressing. That doesn't mean that we don't say there needs to be changes to legislation, but changes to legislation are one thing, making it easier for the majority of people to use is quite another, and I think we can get to that.
That's so interesting, because I have just filled out my self-assessment, and it asked me various questions about whether I was a farmer or a diver. And to me that looks like a level of complexity that perhaps is unnecessary. But maybe it doesn't matter if there are those questions, if I don't have to see them.
Yes.
If the questions that every individual is presented with only apply to them and are straightforward. So we can leave the levels of complexity that there are. But also I was thinking that what some people might see as complexity, other people might see as nuance. And the more we have more and more nuance added into the tax code every year. Chancellors come along and introduce different ideas around, as we've just had stamp duty most recently, inheritance tax that was tweaked by George Osborne in his budgets. Yeah. And that adds more and more rules and ifs and buts, and if you're in this situation, this applies, that. It's complexity, but the argument for it is that it creates nuance, that the people who the government decides have more ability to pay taxes do so, and those less have to pay less. So
well, you're always going to have those sorts of changes come along. And every chancellor's always going to have their good idea. Often it's about getting people to save more, for example. And so, you have PEPs and you have ISAs, and it all changes, fairly frequently, or that's how it feels. And you're also going to have changes because something that was done now is being used for a far different purpose than it was originally intended. And this sort of comes along from time to time. There was a tax relief for making films, and other people use it. And so, these are issues which, unless you say we're going to make no changes whatsoever, we're going to abandon the Chancellor of the Exchequer, we're not going to have any changes any year. What's more, we're going to get rid of lawyers so they can't test the tax code. And by the way, we're going to get rid of all those sort of tax policy advisors who say that these are the ways round. Unless you get rid of all those people, and of course you can't, you will always have changes that are made. And all change brings with it something that is different, and different equals something that's more complicated than was there in the past. And I think you make a very important point, and that is this, that you're never going to get it simple for everybody. You've got a chunk of people anyway where their tax is predominantly dealt with on a PAYE, and so the employer does it, and once that's paid, they actually get their money net of tax. And so that is one way that has actually made the tax system simple for a lot of people. You've then got another group of people who are doing a one job or a two job, and there could you make what it is that they need to fill in much easier for them to do, either by an app or some means whereby they don't get all those questions, they just get that lot of questions. And the answer is yes, you can. And then you've got a percentage. I don't know whether that's 10% or 5% or 1% or 20%, which you're going to have to do the whole enchilada. But the very fact that that is the case doesn't mean that you therefore have to say, oh, because I've got my 1% or my 10%, my 20%, so everybody's got to have everything. It means that you need to be able to take a judgment call and say, I'm going to make it simpler for, I'll do the 80%, and 20% they're going to have to do more. And you're going to make out a judgment. And who the you are in this? Well, in one instance, you can say, well, the Inland Revenue needs to make the judgment call and accept that there's going to be a grey area where it goes wrong, but this will work for the majority. But if they're going to be prepared to do that, we as the public at large have got to accept that things are not going to be perfect, and there'll be areas where it goes wrong, and not then sort of set up this great sort of hands baying to say, who's responsible? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? All of us tend to make our judgments, unfortunately, of the few bits that go wrong rather than the majority that goes right. And when it comes to tax, that means the majority of us now get stuff that's complicated as opposed to stuff that's simple. So there's a discussion to be had, a proper discussion about, that area from that perspective. And from another perspective, can we, as the Office of Tax Simplification, get to a process which just means that you, when you do your tax return, get asked the questions, maybe a little bit more than just the questions that are relevant to you, but you just get asked the questions that are relevant to you in a language that you understand. And that when you've filled in box 8, then it automatically takes you to box 12 because you don't have to do 9, 10, 11 or something along those lines. It'll take a bit, but that's kind of one of the goals that we're aiming at.
Okay. Every government seems to come in and promise to ditch the red tape, bonfire of complexity.
Absolutely.
I wonder how realistic this is. I mean, I know that we've talked about a lot of this being necessary, and the process, making the processes simple, being as important as sort of what's going on in the background. But there are always these silly stories of levels of complexity that seem like they can't be doing anyone any good. You know, the Jaffa cake always comes up, whether it's considered a biscuit or a cake, having a different level of fat applied
I remember
to
it well.
And the other one that was pointed out in your report about gingerbread men, and there's a different rate of tax depending on whether they have chocolate eyes or chocolate trousers. So this doesn't seem to be particularly helpful. So is there a bunch of stuff that is realistic to say, let's just scrap it?
Yes, there is. And in amongst that VAT area, there's got to be quite a lot. And the reason we did a report on VAT, the Office of Tax Simplification did a report on VAT and highlighted in that report some of these extraordinary anomalies, is because VAT will come back to being much more in the control of the UK through the Brexit process than it is at the moment. VAT is a pan-European set of taxations, and we're sort of caught within that. And when the UK decided to join the EU 40 odd years ago, and so absorb all the VAT requirements at that point, effectively it put it into law as to what was the situation in the country then. And I can only assume that the situation in the country then for gingerbread men, as indeed for a whole load of other things, meant that we had equipment that did gingerbread men with buttons, but not gingerbread men with trousers. Or is it the other way around? I cannot remember. And if you go back and you say, okay, well, let's change that, you've got to go back through a whole European process. And so there's stuff which now is anomalous, and we have the opportunity to shift in VAT. But there's also things that we have the ability to shift within our taxation system. There's some complications in corporation tax, which no longer fits together properly. There's a whole series of, reliefs. By that I mean, if you spend this or do that, then, you don't pay tax on it, for activities that we no longer have. So you're absolutely right. There's a whole load of things like that which we're steadily starting to work through, not for the purpose to say it's going to be done tomorrow. This will all have to go back through the legislative process to unmake it. Got to be absolutely sure that it doesn't have a bad interaction. But we reckon that there's things there that need to be done, and we're gradually going to get to them all. But at the same time, that's not going to make any difference to you, and it's unlikely to make any difference to small businesses. So that's why we're saying, at the same time as we're looking at the legislation, which is no longer required, and anomalies that you can put straight and wait in the queue to get that done, we're also saying, but a lot of this lot's all about just administration. It's the buggeration factor. Can we make that simpler? So that is the other side of the work that is underway within the Office of Tax Simplification.
And you were telling me earlier about how the difference that can have in terms of the levels of tax that are actually paid. You gave a comparison to France.
Yes,
things
I know, amazingly. yeah, I know. But you think, this is hugely bureaucratic country, which it is, but has it got some things in there which you wonder, would it be made easier? You see, I believe that the British public is generally honest. They're not going around diddling things. They're honest. But if you make some things really difficult to do, then they'll park them, and they'll park them, and they'll park them. That is human nature. Now, the example that I sometimes use is if you own a property which you then rent out. And lots of people are doing this now. It's not just the buy-to-let, mortgage. It is people do say, right, well, I'm going to invest in buying a second property if I can, and rent it out. And they look at that as part of, their pension, all that sort of thing. So there's an awful lot of second properties which are rented in that way. And if you've got to do your tax return for that, and sometimes, this is the first time you've had to do a tax return because you've done PAYE, it's been done for you before. And you've got to get everything identified. You've got all your costs in there. You've got your gas and your electricity if you rent it out like that, or, whatever. It is a detailed bit of work that you've got to do. Now, if I hop across to France, they've got a different system there. With France, you just declare the total rental that you get. French authorities then say, I think it's 50% is not taxed, and then they tax you one single rate on the balance. That is much easier to do, and especially if yours is a holiday property, which is really complicated because you're only renting it for a certain number of years and there's different people every week and all that sort of thing. And another one is if you're renting out a couple of rooms, you're in this sort of, you're an Airbnb, as it were. So you're using that sort of process to rent out a couple of rooms, and then you've got to split up, your costs and all that sort of thing. And, it's the actions that you've got to do start to increase and increase and increase. You haven't got to do that in France, you just give them one number. And I appreciate the whole thing, you can offset against tax, but it all adds to it. And I just simply think that we probably have a not insignificant slice where the complication of doing that has put people off. And if you make it simpler, you'll either liberate, in this instance, more rooms for accommodation, or you'll get more taxed. You might even get both. And that's why doing things in a simple way is an important thing, because it can work in two directions. More tax gets paid, well, boo hiss, but yeah, hooray, because that's more for goods, for services and public services and all that sort of thing. There's also a fairness aspect, because there's always be somebody who says, I pay tax and he doesn't, and it actually, goes with the grain of the culture of the nation, which is doing it, honestly, rather than saying this is all too complicated and I'm just going to park it.
So if we just treat people a little bit more like grown-ups and say, we're going to trust you to do this, just give us a few simple numbers, rather than showing us all the workings and breakdown and we need to see receipts for this, that and the other all the time, you'll get more money in anyway.
Well, there's one thought. Again, yeah. I'm sure somebody will come on and say that's not correct, but it is a really serious thing to think about. However, the problem is always from getting from A to B, because you've also got a few industries in there. You've got people who actually are doing something. I'll stick with rental for a moment, because they can, offset against the tax, the cost of refurbishment and all that sort of thing. My example for France, you're not allowed to do that. So getting from A to B, you don't want to sort of cut across and suddenly, for all those people that you solve a problem, you create another problem for others. You absolutely have got to think about, what does a transition look like? How do I move? And if I can change something from one method of doing it to another in a manner that is reasonable, perceptionally fair, and doesn't precision bomb some particular group of people, that's great. But if that transition in itself is going to bring with it a whole load of problems, then you need to consider whether it is really worthwhile or not.
Which I think brings us on to end to everyone's favourite tax simplification issue, national insurance and income tax, which to an outsider look pretty much like the same thing in most instances. And lots of people question whether they're split up, because when you put them together, you realise just how much tax you're paying, and people might be more resistant to doing so. Yeah. But to simplify it, there are going to be winners and losers. Tell us how it would play out. Absolutely,
because you are so right. Whereas they both apply to people, they have come from a different base, and so they don't actually match up. And you're so right, from the perspective of an employee, for example, an individual, they're both taxes. They're both taken off your pay, and so you end up with something that is less those two, therefore they both are taxes. Now, there are real problems, because we did this report into income tax and national insurance, and the obvious one that one needs to really address and change is national insurance. It goes up in steps, so it's not smooth. So that means that you can fall from one step across to another with very little increase in your pay, and suddenly you pay a much bigger chunk, goes off in national insurance. The second thing about national insurance is both the employee pays it and the employer. So you in effect have got companies who are doing the two taxations, if you like, from the individual, but then the other, which is theirs. So you've got employers' national insurance, employees' national insurance, and you've got income tax. So now we've got sort of something else added in there. So we had a look at this, and we worked off a very simple basis, which says you keep national insurance, but you make it progressive, the same as income tax. So the thing just sort of smoothly moves along.
Because at the moment, they go up by different increments, but they're not the same increments at all.
Exactly. And then, of course, the end of the year with income tax, you balance up, if you've got different employments, whereas national insurance, you don't. So it's just smoothing the two together so they're operated in a similar manner. Not the same number or anything, a similar manner was the obvious thing to do. And we found that something like, whichever way we worked the numbers, something like 6 million people would be adversely affected by that. Some by a little, some by middle amount, some by quite a lot. So that's not very good in the first instance, which means that if you're going to move, you've got to somehow put a load of money into the system in order to smooth change. But the second, and I think really the hardest one, is the employer's national insurance contribution. Because employers' national insurance, it depends on the number of people that you employ. And as you rightly say, the whole thing sort of goes up in steps. So if you move to a sort of employment tax, any sort of simple way of doing that, you found that the more people that you employed, and especially they were down at sort of lower earners, the big service industry, employers, the shops, that sort of thing, they would in fact be paying much more in national insurance, and then those who employed fewer people at higher salaries would be paying less in national insurance. And that report's out there, and when we put it out there, a lot of people said, you've got to be wrong, got to be wrong. Of course, we'd run the calculations time and time. We said, fine, okay, have a look. Come up with something else where you can bring the two together and make it work better, and you haven't got the same problems as we've found. And so far, nobody's come up with a proposition other than put more money in the system, so you take it out of somewhere else, put it in the system to smooth the transition. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, we've had a lot from small companies who said, we outsource our payroll, so you've got an industry which actually fixes it for you.
An industry thriving on complexity.
So you would never have start today with that system of yesterday. You never would have done, but it's grown up. And if you're going to change, the question is, it's that earlier point I made, you've got to find a way that you can do it which doesn't cause huge problems to people, doesn't cause disruptions, and is therefore actually worth it. And it is debatable as to whether that is the case, or certainly at the moment.
So it's just a constant balancing act between complexity at the expense of whom, and who are the people who could potentially suffer, and how much will it end up costing them. It must be really difficult to do.
Yes, I think it is. I'm glad I'm not the Chancellor who's trying to make some of these decisions.
But also, I mean, you just must sort of hold your head in your hands every time more finance bills are announced and more complexity, because then they also get sort of inbuilt into the system and encrusted in different ways, and thus it continues.
Yes.
I wonder if there's an argument for saying
stop
enough.
The whole lot of it. Yes. Well, I think that right now, most of the finance bill is actually all about, plugging loopholes. And a lot of that is because you've got multinational companies, for example, doing everything on the internet, not with tangible goods and all that sort of stuff. And there's a big international project which says, hang on, we're going to have to look at how you do get to grips with the Googles and the Starbucks and the long list of others that are there. Not because they're doing something wrong at the moment, because they're not. It's just that the legislation that surrounds, what they pay in tax and who they pay that tax to is from yesterday and not from today. And that's really where an awful lot of stuff goes in the finance bill, and I'm delighted to say that's got to stay there. That's not for us. But what we've also got is lots of schemes that come along and they're targeted in one area, and then they get changed or modified, or you move to, the next government comes in and they've got another related scheme. And so there's chunks in there where stuff really doesn't fit together very well. And we're looking at some of the savings regimes. Shortly we propose to do that. We've got a paper we're giving consideration to at the moment, which looks at the different stages of a business cycle, you know, the setup, incorporation, growth and whatnot, and do all the various schemes that in place to help that. Do they tailor together, or do they mean that a company does this when it would really rather do that? And it's just because, you know, there's been different things that have been put into the mix over a period of time and they don't work properly. So we're looking at that type of area, but some of these, you know, 500 pages of a finance bill, that's all about the world has changed.
Angela, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to my reporter's self-assessment app. That sounds good.
Yes, wouldn't it be good? You'll have to judge me on that, won't you?
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for the big money questions.